Was talking with Corey, and I told him, I said, you are not my favorite speaker. And that is all based on hairstyle. He's got a full head of hair, and Tim Lewis doesn't. And so I like Tim Lewis better. But then I saw Corey's title, and it's Thinking and Speaking with Grace, and I thought I better think of some nice things to say about Corey so he doesn't light me up when he gets up here and speaks. I love Corey. He's been here for several times at our lectureships, and I get the distinct privilege of spending a week with him during the summer, and I'll talk about that more tonight when I introduce Corey. But he is a person that loves God and fiercely loves his family, and that is evident, and you can see that when he interacts with Melody, and when his kids are here, you get to see that, and so that is so encouraging to me and a great example for me as a father and as a minister. And so I'm excited that you get to hear Corey again. So Corey, if you'll come and preach to us.
Well, good morning. Unfortunately, you do have to listen to me 3 times. Well, you don't have to listen to me 3 times a day, but hopefully you'll want to be here and listen 3 times today. This is an honor and a privilege always for us to be here with y'all, and we appreciate so much. And one of the things, I'll talk more about the congregation lectureship tonight, but one of the things that I do love about this congregation is your ministers, and I appreciate them so much, and their encouragement and example and influence on me. And I appreciate the way that you love them and support them, encourage them, and I hope that you'll continue to do that. I don't know how many of y'all have ever had wasabi. A couple of years ago, but before I used to preach bivocationally. I ran our family's monument shop and preached full-time at a little country congregation, and we were in Memphis at a monument conference, and the guy that we bought all of our granite from took us out to eat at a really nice restaurant, Texas de Brazil. I don't know if y'all have ever eaten at a Texas de Brazil. Really nice, lots of meat, which is really good. And they've got this huge salad bar. It's got everything you can imagine, sushi and whatnot. My mother-in-law was walking behind me through the line of the salad bar, and there was a bowl there of wasabi by the sushi. Well, I thought she knew what it was. And I said, that's that lime gelatin that they make. Well, I had no idea she didn't know what it was. We're just walking along, and about that time, I felt a slap on my back, and the entire restaurant hears, "Corey, why did you do that to me?" And she had taken a spoonful, put on her plate, then got the whole spoonful and put in her mouth. And as you can imagine, it was quite the scene of her spitting and gagging and trying to get that out of her mouth. Have you ever eaten something that was so bad, tasted so bad, or was so hot, or was so bitter that you just couldn't spit it out of your mouth quickly enough? You did not want that in your mouth. Well, if you have, then maybe what we're going to talk about today will resonate with you a little bit. Not so much in food, although I do have some pictures that I'll warn you ahead of time are a little bit disgusting. So if you have a weak stomach, you might not want to look at the screens as much. I don't look a lot better, but I'll look better than what's on the screen at some point. But when you think about what we're putting in our mouth when it comes to our speech, that's what we're going to talk about this morning. If you'll open up your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 4 is where we're going to specifically talk about. There's lots of passages we could have gone to, like in James 3 where he talks about the mouth and how that it's an unruly fire and the damage that it can cause. We could go to Colossians and look in chapter 3 of Colossians, which is kind of a parallel passage of Ephesians 4 here. But we're going to camp out in Ephesians 4 and talk about all of this for just a moment as we think about the priority of what we're putting in our mouth. There's over in Malmo, Sweden, which you may or may not have heard of. It's the 3rd largest city in Sweden. There's actually a museum called the Disgusting Food Museum. I know. But for only $21, if you're an adult, you can walk through and see over 80 displays of the most disgusting food in the world. And I'm going to read just a few of these that are on there. What you're seeing there on the screen, you may say, what is that? That's not something you eat. That's called mouse wine. They ferment the wine with the mice inside, and then you drink that. If nothing else, it ought to be a memorable lesson. I don't know. Some of the other things that they on their website that they feature is a fermented herring from Sweden, roasted guinea pigs from Peru, maggot-infested cheese from Sardinia, pungent bean curd from China, well-aged shark from Iceland, and infamously stinky fruit from Thailand. Who's ready to go to lunch? All of those things that are you can't imagine putting some of those things in your... Now, in other cultures, different cultures have different things that are disgusting, and different cultures have things that they like, and some of the things that maybe we would like or we would eat, maybe other cultures wouldn't. Maybe some of the things, even in America, you go from one region to the other, and there's different things that maybe we eat in the South that they wouldn't in the West, or they eat in the North that they wouldn't in the Southwest, or whatever. But as you go across the world, there's all kinds of things that we would say, how in the world could you put that in your mouth? When I was living in Denver, there was an occasion, a bunch of us were out to lunch one day, a bunch of guys, and we were talking about different foods, and somehow I brought up barbecue bologna. I don't know if any of y'all have ever had barbecue bologna. The guys in Denver were like, barbecue bologna? What are you talking about? Barbecue bologna? And I said, it's delicious, you know. Well, I invite them over to our house at one point, and I had smoked some bologna, and they're just lapping it up. And they're loving it, of course. Have I never heard of this? And I said, I don't know. It's in every gas station in Tennessee, so I don't know why you've never heard of it. But in any event, as we're talking, they're talking about various mission trips that they've gone on, and eating tarantulas and eating scorpions, and I'm asking them, how in the world can you belittle barbecue bologna after some of the things that you've eaten? Why would you want to put that in your mouth? But yet at the same time, how much more disgusting are some of the things that we put in our mouths by the words that we say? Have you ever had a conversation with someone, a neighbor or a friend, a spouse or a child, and after you walked away, you realized that some of the words that you used were so hurtful and so vicious, and you regretted, and you almost felt that bad taste in your mouth? Have you ever reacted to something that's gone on at work or with someone that you're involved in some sort of club or activity or whatever, and as soon as the words came out of your mouth, you wish you could just grab them and put them right back in, as bad as they taste? As disgusting as some of those foods that you might see at the Disgusting Food Museum can be, how much more disgusting do we allow things in our mouth by the words that we say? When you look at the book of Ephesians, it's a book that's really divided up evenly. The first 3 chapters is about the information. He's talking about the church and what he wants the church to be. And then the last 3 chapters are the application. After he talks about what God has done for us, then chapter 1, this great song of praise about God the Father and God the Son and God the Spirit to the praise of their glory. And he talks about this prayer about, I want you to realize just what you mean to God and what He's done for you. In chapter 2, we've already had lessons, and many that have referenced the grace that He shows, what we were before God, and the grace that He showed us in Jesus, and then what we were after. Chapter 3, he talks about the mystery of the gospel, the good news that God wants everyone to be saved, and He's provided an avenue for that in Jesus. After telling us all of that, then in chapters 4 through 6, he's telling us, here's how you should respond to that. There's a couple of ways we can see how that breaks apart. First of all, there's some petition verbs at the beginning of chapter 4 where he's begging us to understand the need for unity. Also, you can look at the imperatives or the commands. There's only one in the first 3 chapters, and there's 40-something in the last 3 chapters. So in this part, he's really, this is what you need to do. This is how I'm wanting you to respond to the grace that God has shown to you. And in chapter 4, starting in about verse 17, what he's going to tell us is that I don't want you to live the way that you used to live. We talked about yesterday in Romans chapter 6 that when we respond to the grace of God, that we make that conviction in our mind to be dead to sin. I don't want you to live like you did formerly. I want you to live in a different way. A godly way, focused on righteousness. I want you to show that grace that's been extended to you in the way that you live your life, to show your thankfulness to God, to show your commitment to the Lord, allowing Jesus to be your master. And so what he does all through this section, starting in chapter 4 and verse 17, going down even into chapter 5, is he's going to kind of do a back and forth. He'll say, I don't want you to be like this. Instead, I want you to be like this. Tim pointed one of those out just a few moments ago in his lesson about, I don't want you to steal. Those that steal, no more should you be doing that. Don't be involved in that former activity or lifestyle that you were in. Instead, labor, work, so that you can have what you need. But specifically, he says, so that you can have to give to those who don't have. Don't live like you used to. Instead, live this way. When you get down to the end of chapter 4, that back and forth is really focused on our speech. And what he's going to tell us is there's two kinds of speech that we can have. And I know this is not good English. I don't know if Tim's already left. I don't see Tim sitting anywhere. Tim's an English major, so he would not like this. This is not good English, but it's really good theology. Is that our speech can be one of two things. It can be gross or grace. And our speech should be filled with grace, not gross. Again, I know that's not good English, but I hope you remember that that's what he's telling us in these few verses that end chapter 4 and even what goes into chapter 5. So let's talk about both types of these words that we can use, the talk that we can use, the speech we can use. And really and truly what he's going to show us is that it's all reflective on the way that we think about others. Remember we talked about yesterday in Romans that it's all about how do we view ourselves and how do we view others. Do we view others and ourselves as God does? That grace that God has shown us, we need to extend to others. And there's a variety of ways we can talk about that, but specifically in this lesson, we're going to talk about in the way that we talk with one another, the words that we use with each other. And we could even expand that, of course, in our day and time to the posts that we make on social media, of the texts and emails that we send to other people. Is our speech filled with gross or grace? Well, let's look at these two. First of all, the gross communication, the gross talk that he talks about here in Ephesians chapter 4 in the beginning of verse 29. He says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths. That word that's translated corrupting there is a word that literally means rotten. And as I was looking up some of the words and some of the resources to try to get a better understanding of the words in the original language, the way that this word that's translated corrupting in the ESV is used is in a couple of ways that's really, really graphic. Most of the time in the Bible, the way it's used is translated as bad. It's the word that Jesus would say that a bad fruit shows a bad tree. They would often use this word to talk about fruit that had rotted on the vine or had rotted on the tree. If you're like me and you love garden tomatoes, one of the things that really, there's three things, you can't buy in the store that, we all say everything that's homegrown is better, and I guess that's true, but country sausage, garden tomatoes, and country eggs, nothing like what you get in the store. You see a garden tomato and it's rotted on the vine, and you have to have a moment of silence because you're thinking, man. But that's what they would use that for, is fruit or vegetables that had rotted on the vine or rotted on the tree, or a vine or a plant that had gone bad. The other way that this word was often used was they would talk about in the markets. Of course, they didn't have refrigeration like we do in our meat departments. The fish that they would bring in from the sea and they would lay out on the tables for people to buy and bring home for their meals that evening. If it laid out there in the heat too long and that fish began to rotten, and maybe you're even smelling the smell right now, Well, if you can imagine a rotten piece of fruit or a rotten piece of some sort of vegetable, or you can imagine a rottening piece of fish, who's ready to have that for lunch? No one? Why would you want to put that in your mouth? And as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, that's gross. And that's the word that he uses to describe our language and the way that we talk to each other sometimes. Now, here's the problem that we have is a lot of times when we go to these verses, and we've got some young people here, and parents, I'm sorry if I mess you up on any of this. I'm not in any way saying that you ought to use those 4-letter words, okay? But what we typically do is we say, you know, you're not supposed to use the 4-letter words, you're supposed to use nice words. And that, even though, is something that's hard to define, because some of those 4-letter words in certain contexts are okay, right? Words mean what we intend them to mean. Tim used a 4-letter word in his last sermon. Did you hear him? He said, hell. I'll tell y'all, hell. Now, if I'd have said that when I was 7 years old, my mama would have washed my mouth out with soap, right? I can remember in Bible class thinking, should we say that? I'm reading this verse. He told me to read it, but it's got a word Mama said not to say. I don't know what to do now. Why would Mama wash my mouth out? Because it's a dirty word. It's a bad word. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about how do we talk to each other? How do we talk about each other? How quickly, if we hear someone say a bad word, well, we'll go, oh, I can't believe he said that. He cusses like a sailor. How could you use that kind of language around my children? But yet we'll, more gross and more awful tasting terrible words we'll use that aren't 4-letter words, but they're aimed as weapons against our brothers and sisters. And sometimes I think about myself and about others. You know what really needs to happen is my mama needs to just wash my mouth out with soap after that. Didn't say a bad word. Didn't say a 4-letter word. But it was gross language. Corrupting language. So what does that look like? He tells us in Ephesians 4 and verse 31, if you jump on down, he describes this kind of thought process that we have that leads to this gross words. He says, first of all, let all bitterness, this is the things to put away. The bitterness, the word literally would be something that they would use to describe something that tasted very bitter in your mouth. Like if you drank some vinegar or something like that, it's a bitter taste. But it was used metaphorically to talk about this attitude that we have of bitterness where we are holding on to bad feelings about someone else, where we become very self-focused or self-centered and we're holding on to grudges or we're allowing those things that have happened to us, whether real or just perceived, to ruin, to make bitter the relationships, the way we think about people, and then it's going to come out not only in the way that we act, but in the things that we say. He said, let all that bitterness be put away from you. Number 2, he says, let all wrath. And this is like a violent rage that you have where you just want to take out that rage on someone else. You want to show them how upset you are, how mad that you are at them. You want to maybe even try to get even with them in some way, but you want them to know by the way that you treat them exactly how you feel about them. And you show it, and you say it. And when it happens, we ought to say, man, that's gross. Number 3, he says anger. This is more the emotional side of it. But sometimes we don't actually express it in a violent way, but we're holding on to that anger that we have. Earlier in this chapter, he said, be angry and sin not. The way that we allow our emotions to cause us to sin is by holding on to these negative ideas. In fact, in Ephesians, when he says be angry and sin not, he's actually quoting Psalm 4 and verse 4. And what David in context was mad or angry about was the sinfulness of people. Sin ought to upset us. But being angry at each other is not something to hold on to. Having negative emotions towards others is not something we need to hold on into our minds and think in those ways, because if we do, then it's going to come out in our actions, in our words. Number 4, he says clamor. That's shouting or screaming. Have you ever had someone get so mad at you that they get right up in your face and they're just hollering and screaming at you? Well, yeah, I played high school sports. Yeah, I had that happen. Have you ever done that to someone else? Controlled by those vicious and awful emotions, the bad ways in which we think about each other, we're just letting them know how we feel. And it comes out in those ways. And a lot of times, it's not so much what we say, but how we say it. Who has a dog? Anybody have a dog? If you go home this afternoon or this evening and your dog is there when you walk in, if you walk in and look at your dog across the room or across the yard, wherever he may be or she may be, and you were to say, "Come here, you old ugly mud, I'm fixing to take a 2x4 and whop you over the head." What's that dog going to do? Walk right to you with its tail wagging, right? But if you walk in and in an angry, shouting voice say, "Come here, let me give you a T-bone steak," what's he going to do? Take off running. Sometimes it's not just what we say, but it's how we say it. That's the danger, by the way, in text messages and emails and posts, is sometimes we can read into things that aren't there. But clamor, shouting, the way that we're speaking to one another. Slander. This is language that tears down or denigrates someone's reputation, that makes someone look bad. The easiest way for me to look good is to make you look bad, right? And it's tearing down a character assassination, talking in a negative way about someone else. Using those hurtful words to destroy someone. He says, let that be put away from you along with malice, which is this idea of this wanting to hold on to those emotions so they just boil over inside you and it's all that it consumes you. All of that's gross. And yet sometimes, and Tim talked about this back and forth that we do sometimes. Sometimes in our trying to find a balance between truth and love, we want to run to one extreme or the other. In John chapter 1 and verse 14 that Jeff preached on the other night, that Jesus is described with both of those terms, truth and love. We get on our Facebook posts and on our high horse, and maybe we don't even know what's going on, but we'll tell everybody what we think about so-and-so or about whatever's going on or whatever it might be. Spewing that venom. That we ought to say, "Man, I got a bad taste in my mouth." My mother-in-law, I'll tell you another story about my mother-in-law. Since she's 1,800 miles away, I can do that. My mother-in-law loves beets, pickled beets. She's the only person I know that likes pickled beets. Now, I know inevitably somebody will come up afterwards and say, "I love them too." Bless your heart is what we would say in the South. I don't know, but every time that we have a meal at my mother-in-law's house, she'll pull out the jar of beets and she'll say, "You want some beets?" And I'll say, "No." And she'll say, "Why?" And I'll say, "Because I don't like them." "Well, you just haven't tried them." "Yes, I have." "When?" "The last time we ate with you, I tried them." The boys sometimes, I'll tell them, "The reason we had children?" "Why?" "So that she would fuss at you about eating beets rather than me." But anyway, every now and again, just to satisfy her, I'll try a beet. But I always make sure I've got some country ham or some dressing or whatever. I got to get that taste out of my mouth. Paul is saying whenever these things are in our mouths, it ought to have the same effect. Put it away from you. Get rid of it. Take it all. It ought to remind us, bring us back up to verse 17 where he's telling us to get rid of this old way. This is the way the world acts. And we ought not be surprised when the world acts like the world. But when the church acts like the world, it ought to leave a bad taste in our mouth because it's gross. As gross as eating a piece of rotten fish, as gross as eating a piece of rotten fruit. Our speech should be filled with grace, not gross. But then if you go back up to verse 29, notice that he talks about this grace speech here. He says instead of that gross speech that He says, we went too fast there. He says not only should we not have the gross speech, but he says instead what we should have is speech that is only good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. We need to use language, speech that gives grace, that builds up. Those two words that are translated there in yellow, the first one, building up, maybe your translation says edification or something like that. It's the kind of thing, it's the word that they would literally use to talk about building a house or building a building. Something that is helping something productive come along. Something that helps something to grow. Something that was disorganized and maybe not even there to be better, to be effective, to be something that's useful. Our language ought to build people up. And then he says our language ought to be filled with grace. And as we've talked about this week, grace is one of those words that can have a variety of definitions. One of them, in this context, that's true. It's the idea of like goodwill. If you've got a goodwill store, you know, it's one of those where you give things, you donate things so that others can benefit from it. Are you giving language? We'll give that suit or that shirt or those breeches that don't fit anymore. We'll give that for the benefit of someone else, or we give our words away to benefit someone else. That's the kind of language that he says we should have. Well, what does that kind of language look like? He tells us in verse 32. He says, number one, be kind to one another. This word that's translated kind is a word that means morally good or full of love. It's a word where we're thinking about what's best, what's the nice thing I could say. Do you have a mother or grandmother that always say, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all? Wouldn't the world be a lot quieter if we followed that advice? That's the kind of language that we ought to use. How do we build each other up? How do we show goodwill towards others with our language? It's by being kind. And sometimes maybe that takes a little effort, but we can do that. We can look for the good in others if we want to. You know, it's really easy to find bad in other people, isn't it? It's not sometimes as easy to find good. Maybe that's not because of their character, but because of ours. That we're not looking for that good in others. Being kind in the things that we say to each other. He says to be tender-hearted. Maybe if you're using an older translation, it says something like bowels of compassion. When you're a teenage boy and you read bowels of compassion, you can't help but giggle, you know, but literally, that's what it is. But in the ancient world, they thought of the bowels, the stomach area, as being the seat of your emotion. Now, when we talk about emotion, you give a Valentine, it has a heart on it, right? But if you think about it, whenever you hear bad news, where do you feel it? It's like a punch in the gut, right? You remember the first time you held hands with your sweetheart, or that first time you got a little sugar on the cheek? Where did you feel those butterflies? Before I got up here to preach, guess where I'm sick at? To my stomach, you know. That's where they thought of as the emotions. And so this idea of being tender-hearted isn't maybe a literal translation, but it's the idea that they're trying to express. It's feeling the emotions of others, putting ourselves in their shoes. How differently would our language be if we tried to put ourselves in other people's shoes before we responded or talked to them? Jerry Clyer tells a story about this rich man that went into this restaurant one day. The waitress was brand new. It was her first day there. She was very nervous. As she's walking towards him, she accidentally spills the soup all over his very fancy and expensive suit and tie and shirt. And he stands up above her. Everyone in the restaurant turns to look and see what he's going to do to her. She's down on the floor weeping and sobbing as she's wiping it all up. And he leans down and he gets on a knee and he puts his arm around her and he says, "Honey, I hate this happened to you." And Jerry Clyer says, that's love. That's being tender-hearted. That's putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Maybe the way that they responded to me is because they've had a bad day. Before we travel out here, a lot of our well-meaning family members or people at the congregation, will y'all be careful? It's not up to me. I'm just sitting there. Pray that the pilot didn't have an argument with his wife the night before. That's what I want you. Pray that the mechanic was not distracted when they were taking care of the plane. You know, I'm wanting to put myself in their shoes and see it from their perspective. And then number 3, he says, forgiving one another. And this word can mean both and should mean both. It's not only the expression of forgiveness, but it's actually the feeling of forgiveness. It's not enough just to say, well, I'll forgive you, but don't you ask me, you know. It's not, well, I'll forgive you, but it'll take some time. It's not, I'll forgive you if you X, Y, Z, whatever it is that you want. It's removing a debt. It's releasing someone from an obligation. And he tells us exactly why that should be, because of Jesus, God forgave us. Sometime go through your Bibles, through the New Testament, and do a study of all of the things that he tells us that we should be for one another because of God and Jesus. James 2, he says we should be merciful. That mercy that we want is connected with how merciful that we are to others. He says the same thing in the Beatitudes, Jesus does. Forgiveness is linked to how we forgive each other. And maybe sometime go through and study all the one another passages. I've been doing a series of lessons on the third Sunday night of each month on the one another passages in the Bible. We're only going to look at 12 of them this year, but there's about 40 or 50 of them. How we treat one another matters to God. Why? Because we're talking about people that He loves. Now, I'll be honest, Jared could have, I'm not giving him permission because I think he's introduced to me tonight either. Jared could have gotten up there and said almost anything about me, and it would have been okay. If Jared starts talking negatively about my wife, or my boys, or my daughter-in-law, Jared's bigger than me, and he could probably whoop me, but we'd have a problem, you know. If we can understand that, how bad it makes us feel when someone is critical or harsh or mean-spirited toward the people we love, why would we not think God is looking down and saying, how could you talk about my children like that? That Jesus is looking down and saying, how could you talk about my bride like that? He says, put away that gross speech and let's have some grace-filled speech. That disgusting food museum, one of the things, they have a special display right now. If you needed more reason to want to go. Right now, they have a temporary exhibit that's called the Dangerous Food Exhibit. And they talk about in the explanation of this that, you know, we have poisonous and deadly food that throughout the world has been made edible. We eat seeds that contain cyanide. We eat animals with toxic organs. And then they go on to talk about even some of the things that naturally aren't there, but some manufacturers or whatnot put chemicals and dyes and things in the food that is really dangerous. And some of the things that we eat are disgusting, like beets. Some of the things that we could eat, though, are not just disgusting, they're harmful. And I don't want you to walk away from this lesson saying, you know, it would be better if we talk nice about each other. It's not a matter of good or better. It's a matter of life or death, spiritually. We've talked about how much we need and want grace. Well, if I don't show grace, guess how much grace I'll receive? If I don't speak with grace, how much grace will I expect the Lord to give to me? And if we can understand just how much that our language, the words that we use, how it can impact us for good or bad. How much it affects us. Isn't it interesting how much it affects God? Because in the middle of this passage, there's a verse that we kind of have skipped over that really emphasizes just why that our speech should be filled with grace and not gross. And it's a verse that I think maybe is kind of hard for us to even comprehend a little bit. But he says, do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God. The Holy Spirit of God that dwells within us. What does it think? What does He think, I should say? When He's hearing me talk about a brother or a sister in Christ. Maybe not use a 4-letter word. Maybe not use one of those words that would make my grandma cover her mouth and say, oh! But to use language that's gross because it's hurtful. It tears apart. It tears down others. It grieves God. And it ought to grieve us as well. Every Sunday night, at some point, I call it, some of you preachers can appreciate this, I call it Sunday night preacher tired. After you've preached a couple of sermons, you've taught a Bible class, and you've had that emotional drain and the mental drain. Maybe some of y'all's mental capacity is greater than mine, and it doesn't drain you like it does me. But that Sunday nights, you're just wore out, you know. And I'll get a text every single week. I can almost guess when my phone buzzes in my pocket of a lady in our congregation. I actually baptized her last March. And she is on fire for the Lord and wants to know more about how to live for Him. Every Sunday night, I'll get a text message from her that'll say something to this effect. Thank you for 3 great lessons today. I love and appreciate you. While I'm usually sitting there thinking about all the things I forgot to say, or all the things that I messed up saying, or all the things that I wish I'd have said in a different way. And I get that little word of comfort. I have, at our congregation, we're blessed in that we have 3 ministers that have retired from other congregations that have chosen to worship with us. And when I get done preaching, we have 3 aisleways through the middle of the congregation, and I'll go down this aisleway back to our sound booth. And as I'm going down through there, about where Art is sitting is where one of them is, and every single week, every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, as I'm walking by them, he'll raise up a fist or he'll raise up a hand, and he'll say, great job, even when I know it's not. It's amazing how just a few words of encouragement or comfort can mean so much. Our speech should be filled with grace and not gross. And one of the things that I'm thankful for in getting this lesson is it's made me, as I've studied for today, think about how am I communicating that? You know when we usually say nice things about each other? At the funeral. And I decided that I was going to start telling people what I thought about them. So every day, if you're like me, in my phone, I've got hundreds of contacts. Hundreds. And I started at letter A, and I'm just working my way through and every day I'll take 10 or 15 and I'll send a text message to an individual. I hadn't got to the M's yet, but if I was sending one to John Moore, I might say, brother, I love and appreciate you. Your gentle spirit, your genuine love for the Lord and His Word has impacted my life in so many ways. And I'm a better man and a better minister because I know you. I've sent out and I'm not trying to do this. I'm wanting you to understand how pitiful I've been at it before. It's not enough just to not be gross. We need to be graceful. I've gotten replies from a lot of people. I've never had one say, you know, this came at a really bad time. Not once. But I've been amazed at how many people that have sent me a text message back that said, you don't know how badly I needed this today, brother. Because I'm going through this, and I had no idea. Or I just found this out, and I had no idea. We need to look for those opportunities, and it can be something as simple as a text message or a handwritten card. When's the last time you got a handwritten letter or card? To tell people, to use our words to build up and encourage and show grace that has been shown to us. Get rid of that bad stuff. I'm going to tell one, I know the break sign's up there, and I did that because I couldn't remember when I was supposed to be done preaching, but I got a few more minutes. I'm going to tell a story that happened with John. We were in Israel. Melody and I got to go because of the generosity of a supporter of the work at Bear Valley. By the way, you elders and ministers that are in here, if you want to help encourage your ministers or preachers, help them to go on one of those trips. It will change absolutely the way they preach and teach, and it would mean so much to them. We got to go. My wife loves root beer. And we went to a little sandwich shop one day for lunch, and she ordered a sandwich, and she said, "Do you have root beer?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am." We found out later that you could have asked him anything, and he would have said, "Yes, ma'am." He wanted to make a sale. "Do you have unicorn sandwiches?" "Yes, ma'am." So he gives her the bottle, gives her the sandwich. I order mine. He gives us. We sit down at the table, and we start eating. And about halfway through the lunch, Melody says, I'm telling the story of my wife, "I may need a different room tonight, by the way, Lori, to sleep in." So, I don't know. But anyway, we get about halfway through the meal, and Melody said, "I don't think this is root beer." And I said, "Why not?" She said, "It just tastes funny." So I grabbed the bottle, and it's Hebrew all over it. I don't read Hebrew. And definitely not root beer. I give it to Denny Petrillo, and I said, "Denny, what does this bottle say?" Melody thought it was root beer, and he's reading it and reading. Denny can't read Hebrew. And he says, "Well, I definitely see the word for beer, but I don't see the word for root anywhere." At this time, Denny is my boss. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm fired. I'm going to have to walk back from Israel. Well, Melody quit drinking it, thankfully. But I've joked at her ever since. Why did it take you a half a bottle to figure out? Anyway, prayers for our family would be. But as awful as that is, why do we hang on to that gross talk? Why do we keep acting like it's something that it's not? Why do we keep tearing each other down instead of building each other up? We need to speak the truth, but we need to do it in love. We need to put ourselves in other people's shoes and think about maybe what they're going through, or maybe what they've experienced, or maybe how we could be a help to them. Words aren't necessarily good or bad. They're what we use them for. So today and throughout this next week, choose to use your words to build up, to encourage, to show grace. Send a text, send a card, walk up to someone and say, "I just want you to know before your funeral how much I love you and how much you mean to me." You never know the impact that it can have when we use grace-filled words. You also never know how much of an impact it might have if we use gross language to one another. Jesus, through Paul, says, "I don't want you using that gross talk anymore. Get that out of your mouth. And let's use the words, the communication, the power that we have, and the things that we say to each other to fill each other's lives with grace and hope." Thank you for your attention.
It is great news to know that Melody has quit drinking. I don't have to go to the hotel with her, so. Corey was talking about a gentleman in his congregation that he walks by every Sunday and gets words of encouragement. And here at Linder Road, we have somebody like that too. And all the people that say prayers or lead singing or preach, usually when they exit stage, they go down here, and there's a gentleman that sits right about where John and Rebecca is. And he gives them all a high five, tells them good job as they walk by. And that's Ed Ross. And that is so encouraging. And it's over the last several months, one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a line of teenagers that go over and give Ed a hug. Ed is not in very good health and hasn't been able to be here at church for the last couple of weeks. And so for our Linder Road family, if you'll be sure to reach out to him and Becky, that would mean a lot to them. Let's go to God in prayer. God, may we put away all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander. But instead, help us to be kind to one another and tender-hearted. Help us to forgive one another. God, may our speech and our thoughts always be gracious and seasoned with salt, so that we may build up one another and edify each other. And when questions do arise, we may know how to answer each person. Help us to be gracious. In Jesus' name, amen. You haven't